Welcome everyone. Today we're doing a CAPE biology past paper. We're going to look at Unit 2, Paper 2, and this was from the year 2019. Now let's jump into the first question. The first question is from Module 1, which is Bioenergetics. The question states that the initial energy that enters ecosystem is from the sun. Part 1 is to illustrate the flow of energy and nutrients through ecosystems by providing labels for A to F in the flow chart in figure 1. Now let's go and observe, and then we're going to write our answers for this flow chart. And so the first instant, they said energy is coming from the sun and it enters into the set of organisms which are labeled C. And so we should know that producers such as plants will absorb the energy from the sun. And so we're going to put here producers and point out that producers, they are autotrophs because they will convert solar energy into chemical energy. But there will be some energy wasted in terms of heat energy. And then from producers, we'll have consumers. The consumers will take energy from the producers. And also energy will be wasted in terms of heat energy. Now from producers and consumers, what will eventually happen when consumers and producers die, they have to be decomposed by decomposers. So we have E being decomposers. And again, in all cases, we'll have some energy released in the form of heat energy. And also decomposers are very important in converting the organic material coming from producers and consumers back into inorganic nutrients that will be needed by producers such as plants, and the cycle will continue. So now let's look at the next part of the question. And this part of the question asks us to explain the importance of energy flow in an ecosystem. And this question is worth 4 points. All right, so let's start out with this. First and foremost, in the first part, I want to mention that the energy flow is also called the calorific flow. And so we're looking at the amount of energy flowing from organism to organism or through different trophic levels in a food chain or a food web. Now, the first thing I want to mention here is that energy flows through ecosystem to maintain ecological balance. And so let's make that my first point. All right, so again, I'm saying energy flows through ecosystem to maintain ecological balance. All right, and that's very important. For my other point, I'm going to mention right here that each organism or trophic level, so I'm going to make a note in terms of each organism or trophic level, what is happening. So let me just quickly do that. All right, so let me just go back once bit here. All right, I think I could make the point right there. All right, so each organism or trophic level requires a certain amount of energy All right, so this statement here is that each organism or trophic level requires energy for their biological functions, such as growth and development. All right, so it's very important for energy to flow through the ecosystem so each organism can get energy for their biological functions, such as growth and development. Another important point right here is that the energy flow in a declining rate. So I'll make that another point here, that energy flows in a declining rate. All right, and this is very important for energy to flow in a declining rate, because this will ensure, all right, this will ensure that the ratio between prey and predator are maintained. So I'm going to explain this a little bit more. So energy flows in a declining rate to ensure that energy supplies is supplied to the predator is less than what is consumed by the prey. All right, so this is very important because they want to ensure that the prey-predator ratio is being maintained. And this is very, very important, all right, because this will allow a smaller population. So let's make a note of that. So this will result in a smaller population. This will result in a smaller population of the predator. All right, and so this is a very important point, because if the predator is larger than the prey, then eventually the prey will be extinct. All right, so I'm going to make another point right here to conclude this. And I'm going to say right here that the flow of energy reduces to decrease the possibility of extinction. All right, now I'm stating this way, that the flow of energy reduces or decreases the possibility. All right, so the flow of energy decreases to decrease the possibility of extinction of organisms, providing that other factors are constant. So if you think about it in this way, if the predator are consuming more energy than the prey, then the population of predator will be larger. But in a food chain or food web, the predator will receive less energy compared to the prey. And so therefore, the predator population is generally smaller than the prey. And this will prevent the population of the prey to be maintained or prevent them from being extinct. And so if you have a disturbance in the food chain in that sense, then one organism could be extinct, and then there'll be a limited resource for food for predators. All right, and so that will disturb the entire balance of the ecosystem. So it's very useful for energy to decrease along the food chain. And it should also remember the 10% decrease rule, that energy decreases along a food chain or food web by 10%. All right, and so let's go into the other question. And the other question here reads that explain why only a small percentage of energy from sunlight that reaches terrestrial environment enters the ecosystem. All right, the first thing I want to point out, and this is just to give you some extra information here. All right, so I'm going to put this motherfucking red. And what I want to point out is that there are certain things that you need to associate with ecosystem when it relates to energy. So once you hear about energy and ecosystem, there are three things you must consider. All right, and this will assist us in kind of answering the question. And so the first thing I want to mention that energy cannot be created or destroyed. But what can happen, all right? So they can't be created or destroyed, but what can happen is that they may change from form to form, okay? So may change from one form to another. All right, so that's one important point I want to mention there. Another important point that I need to mention is that the more energy is being transferred, so the more energy is being transferred, the more waste energy is, or the more waste you will get. All right, so that's very important to note, is that the more energy is being transferred, the more energy is being wasted. And the third and final point I want to make right here is that longer food chains, and this for this reason that I mentioned in the second point. So longer food chains, are less effective. All right, so just to make a note of that. So energy cannot be created or destroyed, but may change from form to form. And again, the more energy is being transferred, the more energy is being wasted. And so for this reason, longer food chains are less effective than shorter food chains. All right, because remember now, the longer the food chain is the more energy will be transferred, and hence you have more wasting of energy. And you should remember the flow chart we have up top, that each level of the ecosystem, whether it be producer, consumer, or even decomposers, energy is lost to the environment by heat. All right, and so this will kind of help us now in terms of answering the question or guide us in a certain way or to a certain extent. And so now let's start answering the question real quick. And so I'm going to start now. Let's put this one in blue. All right. So the first point I'm going to make here is that plants, because remember now, the only organisms that can actually absorb light energy, right, they are producers, right? So plants and plant-like organisms that photosynthesize, they actually absorb the energy from the sun, which is the solar energy, and convert it to chemical energy. Chemical energy are being transferred between organisms. So between the consumers, they will transfer chemical energy. All right, and so that's very important to know those things. All right, so the first thing I want to mention here, why less energy will be transferred or enter the ecosystem, is first point is that plants they have waxy cuticle. Okay, the plants have waxy cuticle. All right, that reflects light. Okay, that reflects light. That's the first thing that I want to mention right there. All right, so plants have waxy cuticle that reflects light. The other point that I want to make note of is that over 90%, and we can say between 98, all right, so anywhere between 98 to 99 thereabout, Right, that's how high it is. So over 90% of light energy is reflected from leaves. Okay, so a lot of energy is being reflected. Light energy is reflected from leaf itself. A great deal of it. All right, so over 90%. Let me say over 90% of light is reflected from leaves. Okay, that's very important for us to understand. And so if most of it is being reflected, then only a small amount of percentage of light is actually being absorbed by the leaf, right? So let's make a next point with that. And someone say here now, since most of the light is being reflected, only a small percentage is actually being absorbed. All right, so that's very important. Now, the next point I want to make here now, and it's referred to light itself, the properties of light, and in terms of chlorophyll, in terms of leaves. And the next point I want to make right here is that red and blue light, okay, just to make a note right here. So red and blue lights are most effectively absorbed, okay? And what I'm referring to blue and red light right here being most effectively absorbed is that white light contains 7 colors of light, which is Roy G. Biv. You should remember that, right? So I must put on the side right here just for our memory. So Roy G. Biv. So it is orange, it is red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And so out of the 7 colors, red and blue are the most effectively absorbed by plants, by green plants. And so therefore the other colors are pretty much wasted for the most part. They are absorbed, but they are most wasted and effectively used compared to red and blue light. And it depends on the wavelength of these different colors of light, which make the difference in terms of absorption rate. And so what I also want to mention here is that, let's make this a note right here, is that green light, okay, just to make a note that green light is almost, I'm going to put the word almost completely, okay, completely reflected, okay. All right, so it is almost completely reflected. That's very important to make that white light almost completely reflected. While the other colors all right, so let me say other colors or wavelength, okay. All right, so all the other colors are wavelength are minimally absorbed. All right, so the 2 colors that are mainly used by plants will be red and blue light. And so if there are 7 colors, that means most of the light itself is not used effectively for photosynthesis or the production of energy. Okay, so that's another property of light that will cause less energy to enter the ecosystem because the producers will not absorb as much of the light energy that is being available to it. Not only that, I must also mention that other factors or other environmental factors also affect how plant absorb light. Okay, so it's not only the plant and the light itself that will determine the amount of light is being absorbed, but there are other environmental factors, okay? All right, so other environmental factors affect the absorption of light by plants. That's very important to also note. And let's talk about two of them, for example, here. So let's put two examples of these environmental factors that I'm talking about. One of such environmental factor that I want to mention here is that of water. So I'm going to make a note that if water is low, so if water is low, for example, in some times you may have dry season, you may have drought, and rain is not always falling, right? And roots are not always deep enough to absorb water out of the soil, right? Or enough water out of the soil. So if water is low, the light energy if water is low, the light energy absorbed will not be effectively used. So even if the plant absorbed enough light that it needs because of limited amount of water, then definitely the amount of light they can't be effectively help to convert water and carbon dioxide into sugar, right? So will not be effectively used to make sugar. All right, so that's very important right there. Or chemical energy. Okay, so it's very important. All right, so that's a point right there. I'm going to also mention another factor that will affect the amount of light being absorbed by plants. And so right here I'm going to say now, if the nutrients, okay, that are needed to make chlorophyll if they are low, the rate of absorption of energy will also be low. So if the nutrients needed to make chlorophyll, all right, are low, the rate of absorption of light will also be low. So if the plant is not producing enough chlorophyll, then it will affect the rate of absorption of light as well. Because as plant leaves get older, in fact, they become less effective in absorbing light over a period of time. All right, and that's why some leaves eventually turn yellow, if you notice it. All right, so next point I want to make here now is that in terms of plants themselves, so I'm going to make a note about the plants here. So I already talk about plants in terms of effectively absorbing light. So it's also important to note that plants themselves, okay, use approximately, right, use approximately I'm going to say 90%. Oh, wow. Mistake. All right, good. Use approximately 90%. I'm going to say 90% because remember the 10% transfer of energy, the rule about 10% energy being transferred. So plants themselves use approximately 90% of the energy they absorbed. Okay. All right, just to make a note of that. All right, so use about 90% of the energy that they absorbed. And so they use this energy for their own functions, which are their biological functions, which will be growth and development. So just to make a note of that. All right, so let's continue with a few more points to top this off. And so let's put another point right here. And the other point I want to make note of is that energy will decrease by 10%, just for you to remember that energy decreases by 10%. All right. And this is some extra information here, 10% between, because this is going into the ecosystem now, but the question was saying not entering the ecosystem. So actually, this is some extra information. So once energy gets into the ecosystem, then only 10% will be transferred between organisms, all right, or trophic level, all right, between, let's say, each trophic level. All right, just to make a note of that. All right. Also, what I want to mention here now, so this actually could change this piece in red. This is just like extra information right here. So once energy gets into the ecosystem, only 10% will be transferred. But let's get back into another point here that will be very important, why less energy will eventually enter the ecosystem. And so this point here will talk about other substances or molecules, right? So other molecules, I could just say molecules in the ecosystem. Let's just start with say molecules in the environment, and absorb energy as well. Okay, so absorb light energy. Okay. So all energy coming from the sun will not go directly into plants only, but other molecules in the environment will also absorb energy. And since other molecules are absorbing energy, it's also important to note that some of these molecules absorb energy at a faster rate compared to plants, right? They can just say some molecules absorb energy at a faster rate compared to plants. All right, so that's very important. What I also want to make mention of, this is the last point I want to make right here, is that most plants, right, just to make a note, right, that most plants or plant parts, okay, or plant parts are not even consumed by consumers, all right, or herbivores, all right. So most plant parts or plants themselves are not eaten or consumed. Okay, so are not eaten or consumed by herbivores or consumers, right? Let's say consumers. All right, so that's very important to note right there, right? So most plant or plants material, they're just not eaten by most organisms or most consumers. Right, a lot, so therefore a lot of energy will remain in the plant itself and less will be passed on in the, so most of the light that is absorbed by the plants, they're not actually used up by organism. All right, because of course most plants are generally eaten by most organisms. For example, if you look at a goat or a cow grazing, they'll graze on a specific type of plants, and not all the plants or all of the plant they may actually eat. Sometimes only the leaves or only some part of the plants as well. All right, and some plants they only eat the stem. All right, so that's very important to make a note right there. Now let's jump on to the next part of this question, right? And this is part B. I'm going to end with part B for now. And so, in the interest of time, because time's against me. And so here now, say mitochondria are important for making energy available within cells. So figure 2 is an incomplete diagram of the longitudinal section of a mitochondrion showing only the outer membrane. So there is only the outer membrane being shown. All right, so actually give us a part right there. So complete the diagram in figure 2 and include labels to illustrate the structure of the mitochondrion. So they want us to complete this diagram here and also to label these different structures. And so they actually give us one part, which is the outer membrane. So what I'm going to do right here, let me put this in blue, so a little better for you to see. The first thing I'm going to start out with is to draw another layer right here to make it a little bit, I want to say 3D, but so you can see obviously the different parts of the mitochondria itself, right? And so what I'm going to do now is to draw the other part, is internal part. It's not hard to draw. So what I'm going to do is just to do something like this. And then I'm going to make some layers like that. I'm going to come around here. I'm just do it like that, scribble. I mean, some of you will be better in drawing this, but you know, I'm going to draw like that and then come here. All right, not to waste too much time drawing this thing. All right, so just some folds. I'm going to talk about what those folds are. All right, and so that is the mitochondria. All right, now we're going to label this in terms of the different parts. And so what I want to do is to label, let's say, start with the outer membrane. So they actually talk about the outer membranes. I'm going to label this part here as the outer membrane. All right, as a matter of fact, there are 3 membranes. Well, not 3 membranes, 2 membranes really, that we really need to know. All right, and so that's another part right here. And the space between those two, I'm going to leave it right here. And then I'm going to talk about the space in between right here. I'm going to leave it on that side. And these little projections, they are finger-like projections in a sense. All right, so I'm going to label those as well. Let's just put 2 of them. All right, and that will be it. All right, so let's start off with our labels. All right, and so let's start off here, going outside in. So here is our outer membrane. So this will be our outer membrane. All right, and then this will be our what call it intermembrane. Let's start labeling right here because it's going to be a longer word. That's an intermembrane, and then this will be our inner membrane. So make sure you know the difference as well. So have the intermembrane. A matter of fact, let me correct this, intermembrane space rather than saying intermembrane. There's an intermembrane space. All right, so that's very important. And then now we have our intermembrane. So you have the intermembrane space, and now we have an inner membrane. All right, and then now we have this the innermost part, which is called the matrix. This will be the matrix. And then the projections on the inner membrane, those are called the cristae. One is called a crista. Okay, so this will call the cristae. All right, so that's a cristae right there. All right, so pretty much that's the mitochondria. All right, without this line here, that's also fine. You didn't have to put this line. You could just label this dark line that they actually drew before as the outer membrane, as they mentioned in the statement. All right, so you don't need this line actually. I mean, it's there. You could put it there just to make it a little bit more 3D looking, you know. I just like it that way. All right, so let's go to the next part of the question now. It said, explain the structure of the mitochondrion. Explain how the structure of the mitochondrion is important for its function in respiration. And here there's a number of things to talk about. So let's quickly just start by giving a little bit of information right here. So the first thing I want to mention is that there are 3 phases of respiration. Okay. And so here we have our glycolysis first. Okay. Glycolysis. And just to make a note of this is that this takes place in the cytoplasm, and also make a note of that. So this takes place in the cytoplasm. All right. And then coming down from the Krebs cycle. The next, from the glycolysis, the next stage is the Krebs cycle, otherwise called a citric acid cycle. So here we'll have the Krebs. Okay. So we have our Krebs cycle. And then we go into what they call our ETC. And just to make a note that the Krebs cycle is actually taking place in the matrix of the mitochondria. So that takes place in the matrix. And then we have our last phase or stage, which is called ETC, which is electron transport chain. All right. And this is a very important stage, which is the last stage, is called it, and this takes place in the inner membrane. Okay. Just to again make a note of that, where they actually take place. So glycolysis does not take place in the mitochondria, but it takes place in the cytoplasm. All right, and that's the order in which they actually occur. So first stage, it is glycolysis. Second stage is the Krebs cycle, and the third and final stage is the ETC. All right, and in the ETC, actually refer to it as oxidative phosphorylation. Just to make a note of that as well. All right, so let's now get into the structure and the functions as it relates to respiration. So let's start out in terms of outside in, but I want to point out that, let's start out like that, but I want to point out that there are certain things that occur before another point. So what I may do at the end of it may give you in terms of the order, in terms of the respiration process, right? So as you know that the matrix, right, the process will take place in the matrix before actually going to inner membrane. And so also go back to the diagram to show you what I'm talking about. So the matrix is the most internal part here. So the second stage is actually taking place in the innermost part of the mitochondria. Then it goes into the inner membrane right here. Okay, so just to make a note of that. So they actually have in different places. So the second stage, again, as I mentioned, takes place here in that region. And then the final stage will take place in here. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to explain from outer membrane, intermembrane, then inner membrane. Then I go to the Krebs stage, then I go to the matrix. Okay, so I'm doing it in order of structure from outside in rather than the process of respiration itself, which I think it doesn't matter really. But because they only want us to refer to the structure and their functions with regards to respiration. But if you want to do it in order in terms of what happened first, second, and so on, that will be also nice to do that, all right? But let me just start in terms of where the structures are, all right? And so let's start with outer membrane first, okay? So the outer membrane. So the outer membrane is very important because it contains some transport proteins. So I'm going to say this one contains transport proteins. All right, and the transport proteins are needed for the passage of pyruvate. Okay, so the transport protein needed for the passage, all right, of pyruvate. And pyruvate actually made by glycolysis in the cytoplasm. So once they're made in the cytoplasm by the process of glycolysis, and glycolysis is where glucose split into two molecules of pyruvate. So there's a 6-carbon molecule converted into two sets of 3-carbon molecules, just to make a mention of that, right? All right, so process of pyruvate into the mitochondria. All right, so that's very important there. All right. Now, the next one here now we're going to talk about is the intermembrane space. The intermembrane space is not a great deal of function. We're concerned what is happening to respiration or for the process of respiration really. But it serves an important function though, but not a lot of functions that are there, no major role, because it's a passageway, really. So what happened here is that it aids in the movement, okay, so it aids in the movement of substances between the outer and inner membranes. All right. So that's also important. All right. So it's very important that substance will pass through the intermembrane space to get into the matrix and also into the inner membrane. What is also important is that the intermembrane space also aids in oxidative phosphorylation, right? Because this is where you have your surge of hydrogen ions, all right, being deposited, all right, and then they will enter into the inner membrane, and so the ATP synthase can now able to produce a surge of ATP. So it's very important where that is concerned. So actually aids in oxidative phosphorylation. All right, so that's very important there to note. All right. All right, so without the intermembrane space, a lot of the hydrogen ions will be wasted that are very important. It needed to release those free electrons when NADH is converted to NAD plus. So that's very important there as a function of the intermembrane space. All right, so let's go into the inner membrane now. And the inner membrane is actually where the last stage of respiration takes place. So you actually could put this last. If you need, you could put this very at the last. And so why not do that? Let's do that, because let's put the inner membrane at the last point, because I want to do this in order of how respiration takes place, right? So the outer membrane will collect the pyruvate and allow the pyruvate to go into the mitochondrion. And then the intermembrane space now will allow the substance to pass through or passage from the from the outer membrane to the inner membrane, and then it will go into the matrix, and that's where the next part of respiration will take place. So let's talk about the cristae first, which is just the folds of the inner membrane. All right, so let's talk about the cristae. And so here the cristae, they are very important now in increasing the surface area. So they increase the surface area of the inner membrane, okay? Of the inner membrane. All right, let me just go back. Of the inner membrane. All right. So increase the surface area of inner membrane. And so this result in a greater production of ATP. All right, so that's very important there. Now let's talk about the inner membrane now. Let's go to the matrix now, because as I said, as I mentioned, that the inner membrane is where the last stage of respiration will take place. So let's talk about the matrix. And I could go on my flow chart right here, just to kind of point it out again. So remember, cytoplasm is the first place, then the matrix, then the inner membrane. Okay, so just to make a note of that. So that's the order in which respiration takes place. All right, so let's put inner membrane on the next page right here. So let's talk about the inner membrane right here. Then, and also the matrix. So the next stage will be in the matrix. All right, and so what takes place in the matrix, as I mentioned, it is where you have the Krebs cycle taking place, otherwise called a citric acid cycle. So here now is that the matrix is responsible to convert the pyruvate. Remember, the pyruvate comes from glycolysis, right? So responsible to convert pyruvates, let's say pyruvates, because there are two molecules of pyruvates, to acetyl CoA. Okay. All right. So it's very important to convert pyruvates to acetyl CoA. Very important to make a note of that. Now, what is also important in the matrix as well, let's put this piece right here, is that the matrix is very important in producing citric acid. So it produces citric acid, all right, via the Krebs cycle. All right, just to make a note of that. Now, also what I want to point out right here is that is a really complicated process taking place here, or a complex, I won't say complicated, but complex process taking place. And so what I'm going to do is quickly summarize exactly what is happening in the Krebs cycle as a summary, because what comes in is a pyruvate molecule, which is a 3-carbon molecule. So pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule, just to make a note of that, that comes in from glycolysis, all right, which is from the cytoplasm. And then what will happen next is that it will convert into two things. It will convert, let's put one up here and one down the bottom right here. It convert into a 2-carbon molecule, and it's the 2-carbon molecule. I'm going to give you the names of these things. All right, so the 3-carbon is pyruvate. Let's put that right there. All right, so it's pyruvate, and it converts into a 2-carbon molecule, and the 2-carbon molecule that is being converted right here is called acetyl CoA. All right, and then it also eventually convert into what they call a 4-carbon molecule. All right, so there will be a 4-carbon molecule as well. And this 4-carbon molecule is called fumarate. All right, and then eventually they will join together and form a 6-carbon molecule. So once the 2-carbon merges with the 4-carbon molecule, it forms a 6-carbon molecule. And the 6-carbon molecule is called citric acid. And that's the objective of the Krebs cycle. So let me just put arrows to indicate what I'm talking about. So the pyruvate will eventually turn into the 2-carbon molecule. The 2-carbon molecule will join, so put a plus sign right here, will join with a 4-carbon molecule, which is fumarate. And then both of them now together will produce our 6-carbon molecule, which is our citric acid. And so that's how the process of the Krebs cycle takes place in summary. Now, if you need to expound on this, you can also talk about other molecules, because remember, it will move from 6 into 5 into 4. And so what we can also talk about is chemicals that are involved in this process, or the change of carbon molecules. So you can talk about the succinate. Okay, so succinate is also important. You can also mention that. All right. And just to mention that succinate actually will eventually turn into oxaloacetic acid. Okay, so let me just put that real quick. All right. So oxaloacetic acid, all right, will be another substance right there, right? So, and then eventually, just to make a note of that, eventually it will form into the fumarate. Okay, so this is actually how the process actually takes place. Okay, so you move from succinate, all right, so you have a citric acid form, then you have a succinate form, and then you have the oxaloacetic acid, then you have the fumarate forming, which is a 4-carbon. So remember, move from 6 into 5 and then into 4, okay? And so this is the process here, the summary of the whole process. And now after the matrix, which is the Krebs cycle, so the Krebs cycle takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. And then the very last stage will take place in the inner membrane. So let's talk about the inner membrane right here. This is the very last stage, all right? So the inner membrane. All right, and what takes place in the inner membrane here which is the last stage that I mentioned, is the ETC. All right, so but I want to make a note here that this part contains proteins. Okay, so it's very important. Matter of fact, a whole lot of proteins. So it contains a chain of proteins or a lot of proteins. Okay, so contain proteins that aid in the transport, all right, or movement. Okay, so let's say transport, but it's actually a transport chain, transport of electrons, okay, in the transport of electrons. As I'm saying, there are a number of different proteins within the inner membrane. And not only that, but not just the movement of electrons alone, but it also contains a special protein that is called the ATP synthase. And so what will happen here is that also there's a synthesis of ATP. So, and this synthesis of ATP. All right, and the synthesis of ATP, I'm going to make a note of that. That is it done by what they call the ATP synthase. Okay, by the ATP synthase. All right, so great. And so that's very important for us to note that. Now, what also takes place inside of the inner membrane is what they call the oxidative phosphorylation. So this is where oxidative phosphorylation takes place. All right, and this is otherwise called ETC. I could just put right here ETC right here. All right. What is also important that I want to make mention in the inner membrane space right here is that this is where the most ATP is formed. Okay. So the most ATP are formed here. All right, just to make a mention of that as well. And the amount that is formed will be 32 ATP, just to make a mention of that as well. And just to point out that in the glycolysis is only 2 ATPs formed as a net, a total of 4, all right, at the expense of 2. In the Krebs cycle, you only get 2 ATP. In the ETC, you get 32 ATP. So overall, respiration process produces 36 ATP. All right, and also just want to make a note that this is the final stage of respiration I mentioned before. What I also want to mention is that NADH will convert into NAD plus. All right, so let's put the plus there, NAD plus, and also H plus. Okay, all right, let me just take out this plus to make it a superscript. I thought let me write that in. So NAD plus and Na and H plus ions that will be formed. And the reason I'm telling you this, because this process here will release a lot of high energy electrons. Okay, so let's say to release a high level or to release a lot of high energy electrons. All right, and these electrons will be transported along the inner membrane, and that will be responsible to produce a lot of ATP. All right, so this is where energy transferred from one form to another form is being taken place. In ATP synthase will generate 32 molecules of ATP. All right, and this is where we're going to end with this question again. I'll see how quickly I could come back and finish up the other questions as quick as possible if I do have the time. But now keep safe, do well on the examinations.